Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the tundra-strewn scrubland 40 miles away from Nome, Alaska. Nome first came to fame in the public eye in the early 1900s due to a gold rush in the area. People flocked from around the world to try their luck at pulling gold from his desperate and hostile landscape. The city of Nome claims to have the largest gold pan in the world on display, and its legacy as a gold rush town still dwells in the inhabitants here. The climate here is a subarctic climate, which means temperatures range dramatically from season to season. Since it is located near the sea, the humidity moderates these temperature swings compared to more inland locations, but January still averages only 5 degrees Fahrenheit and July averages 52 degrees Fahrenheit. With just over 17 inches of precipitation each year, this area sees a small amount of rain or snowfall on most days. This land is rolling hills covered with gray willow interrupted by stands of balsam poplar and black crowberry trees. Blue joint and common woodrush are grass-like plants that grow around every area with enough water to support them. Animals you might see if you visit Nome include muskox, moose, and caribou. The predators that prowl this area include wolves, wolverines, and brown bears, but this is also the winter range for polar bears and their common companion, the Arctic fox. The Seward Peninsula has over 300 miles of gravel roads, which allows its visitors abundant access to remote locations. But some of these locations are so isolated that in the event of a problem, you may be on your own to solve it. The surf pounds the rocky shore, which gives way to sandy beaches, while glacial streams bubble up from subterranean aquifers, providing the visitors, animals, and plants pure and clean water for survival. On July 12, 2021, Richard Jesse was heading out to his remote mining camp. He was approaching his 6th decade in life, and his values were changing. He didn't mind being alone in remote locations while he searched for gold and basked in the solitude of the area. He had brought his four-wheeler in to help him search the area around his mining site and had a towable trailer he pulled behind it to haul his gear. He did bring a cell phone, but not an emergency beacon, as it seemed counterintuitive to the isolation and privacy the area offered him. If he needed help, he clearly understood that he would simply call for it on his cell phone. He also neglected to bring bear spray, as he didn't plan on having any problems with the bears in the area. They had never bothered him much before, so why would this trip be any different? The only self-defense item Richard had brought with him was his pistol, though it isn't clear what brand, make, or caliber it was. He brought about a box of pistol ammo with him, just in case. Before departure, Richard had made sure to tell his friends where he was going and what time he should be back. This is a basic responsibility of anyone going into the backcountry, but if something tragic happens before your return time, you may end up in a life-and-death struggle until your deadline arrives and searchers are notified and rounded up to find you. Just after arrival, Richard hopped on his four-wheeler and pulls his trailer a few hundred yards from his mining camp. He had been searching for gold in the creek that meanders through the willows around his camp, and had decided to pan in a spot he hadn't searched before. As he drove along the creek bank, his vision was filled with an angry brown bear closing in on him. For a moment, Richard was unsure if the bear may simply run past him, but as it closed in, he could see its eyes focused on him and nothing else. It was clearly not trying to escape to safety, but to confront him with its teeth and claws. The giant bear easily flipped over Richard's four-wheeler and small utility trailer as if they were toy cars. In the blur of an attack, the brown bear knocked the man to the ground and clamped its jaws onto his ankle. It began dragging him toward the creek, and he was certain it was taking him into the cover of the willows, where no one could intervene in the attack. As the bear dragged Richard across the rocks along the bank of the river, he managed to pull his pistol out. He fired once at the bear, which immediately released its grip on his ankle. Scrambling to his feet, Richard scampered through the willows and grass back to the relative safety of his campsite and locked himself inside his makeshift cabin. This wasn't the end of the confrontation for the bear. It could have easily licked any wounds it may have had from Richard's pistol, if he even hit it, and went on its way. Instead, the bear followed him back to his cabin.
Richard could hear the bear's claws being dragged over the outside of his cabin walls as it searched for a way to get to him. It seemed to examine the entire perimeter of his cabin as it scratched and clawed at the wood siding which held the building together. As it rounded his small cabin, it peered into the windows, perhaps in part out of curiosity, but persistently trying to get at its victim. He searched his pocket for his cell phone to call for help, but was mortified when he realized that it must have fallen from his pocket when the bear attacked him at the creek. The heaviness of having no way to reach out for help paralyzed him. After several tense minutes, the bear disappeared. Richard knew he only had a few rounds of ammunition with him, and was terrified at the thought of the fearless bear returning to see if it could finish him off. He trembled in the darkness of the one-room shack and watchfully searched through the window, worrying about the bear's return. As night fell, Richard readied himself for whatever the dark would bring. He knew that bears are most active around the beginning and end of the day, so if it was planning on returning to him, it would most likely be during the dark of night. Richard's suspicions proved accurate. In the middle of the night he could hear the bear breathing as it circled his cabin. He again heard its claws raking the exterior walls and listened as it continued to search for access to him. It had apparently been able to smell the blood near his ankle from its attack earlier in the day. The night slowly passed as Richard stood guard without sleep, waiting to see what the bear's next move might be. By daybreak, Richard was exhausted, from the adrenaline of the prior day's attack and the sleepless night of listening to the bear looking for entry into his cabin. He was surely hoping that the bear had lost interest and wouldn't be returning, but when survival conditions you to pursue food at all costs, this isn't likely. Richard whiled the day away, spending his time examining the wound on his lower leg and the massive bruising on his chest. Apparently, during the attack, the bear had struck him in the chest, which was most likely the blow that had knocked him to his back, just before the bear had bit onto his ankle and began dragging him toward the creek. It happened so fast that he still couldn't put the timeline together in his mind, and he knew he couldn't allow himself to be killed and eaten by the bear if it returned in the night. As the shadows again stretched long, a sense of foreboding undoubtedly crept into Richard's mind. He had watched as the bear persistently tried to get into his cabin the first day, and then return under the veil of darkness to do the same. Tonight might be the time it figured out how to crash through the small window or through the door to get at him. He was too terrified to risk the short trip to the outhouse to relieve himself, because he had no idea if the bear was still in the area. For all he knew, it was hiding in the willows nearby, waiting for him to re-emerge, ready to pounce on him and kill him. In a prolonged and dangerous situation, your mind can tend to run through horrific scenarios. Each bump in the night or the wind rustling through the bushes can conjure frightening monsters that predict your actions or somehow resist your defensive efforts. Adding in the exhaustion and injuries, there is no doubt that Richard was in for another long night. As he hid in his cabin and the night passed slowly, Richard could hear the bear clawing at the siding on his cabin once more. He listened as the bear worked its way around the perimeter once again, but this time it did something it hadn't done previously. Richard could hear the bear approach the door of his cabin and sample the air seeping from its hinges. He could hear the bear raking its claws over the door jamb, searching for a place to pry it away from the cabin. It wasn't but a few seconds before the door gave way and fell from its hinges. Richard knew this was the time he had to use some of the precious rounds from his pistol. He fired toward the door opening, now backlit by the night sky. He wasn't sure if he had hit the bear with any of the rounds he fired. He only knew it had disappeared from the opening of the door and into an uncertain location. Needless to say, Richard didn't sleep that night either. He stood guard, pistol at the ready, waiting for the bear to return. Daylight came, and he knew he had to do something to find help for himself, or this bear might return and kill him. Richard climbed up to the roof of his cabin and in huge letters scrawled the letters SOS and curled up in the shelter of his cabin, hoping that somehow someone would see his cry for help. On July 16th, about 185 miles to the north, a Coast Guard helicopter was getting ready to fly from Kotzebue to Nome. It was carrying a team of scientists who were tasked with research in the Bering Sea. A short distance into its travel route, the helicopter ran into a mass of dense clouds and had to change its route by about 1 mile. As the helicopter flew across the ground, they noticed a man waving his arms around while holding up a white piece of cloth. They could see writing on the roof of the buildings requesting help. They immediately circled and reduced their altitude so they could land and investigate what had occurred. As the crew examined Richard, they could see he was all beaten and battered, and he had only 2 remaining rounds in his pistol. His leg was wrapped with an improvised bandage, and he had bruises on his chest and various other parts of his body. The Coast Guard crew helped Richard aboard the helicopter and quickly lifted off. Richard relayed the details of his encounter with the brown bear as the helicopter crew rushed him to Nome and the ambulance waiting for him there. After the helicopter landed, Richard walked himself to the ambulance. He was hesitant to lie down on the gurney and had obviously begun to come down from the adrenaline of the past 4 days. An Alaska State Trooper, Aileen Witowski, noted that Richard wasn't mauled in the classic sense, but had sustained several injuries during the altercation with the brown bear. The wounds Officer Witowski couldn't see were the mental ones, the terrifying dreams that would pull Richard from peaceful rest each night. Richard stated that he would forever remember the face of the Coast Guard helicopter crewman who had rescued him. He expressed gratitude that someone was looking out for him. His lesson in all of this was that he should never go out alone and swore to never do that again. As for the bear, there was no source I could find that indicated if any of Richards's bullets wounded the bear or if it was the same bear that had tormented him each night. There was no indication of any hunting party setting out to kill the bear, and it appears to have been chalked up as an unfortunate incident in which the bear may have been protecting her cubs in the initial attack. The Alaska Wildlife Agency says that when you run into a bear, you should try to back away slowly and stay calm. You should talk calmly to the bear and face toward it. Staying in groups can help deter an aggressive or curious bear, and you should try to look larger by slowly waving your hands above your head. If the bear follows you, then stop your retreat. If it focuses on an individual, use nearby items to make noise, bang pots and pans together, raise your voice, and throw rocks or sticks, as well as deploy bear spray once the bear is in range. In regard to keeping bears away from your camp, they say to keep garbage and food secure and clean up each day before retiring for the night. Surprising a bear can be deadly, so make noise, especially when hiking. If you walk upon a bear, give it space and maintain a few hundred yards of distance as much as possible. There weren't any sources that indicated Richard violated any of these guidelines in the lead-up to his attack, with the exception of riding his four-wheeler very near to the bear and possibly its cubs. Alaska has an estimated 30,000 brown bears and 100,000 black bears. A report in 2019, published by Alaska health officials, indicated that 68 people were hospitalized in 66 bear attacks between the years of 2000 to 2017. There were 10 human fatalities due to bear attacks during this same time period. Petty Officer Allie Blackburn indicated that it is very unusual to have several encounters with the same bear, which makes Richards's case very unusual. After reviewing the details of this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think it was the same bear that was harassing Richard each night at his cabin? Do you think the bear's initial attack was predatory or defensive? Should Richard have ventured out during daylight hours in search of his cell phone? What could Richard have done differently to avoid this bear attack or find help once it happened? I will be glad to read and answer your questions, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to Herzegovina in Bosnia in southern Europe. This area is known as the Balkan Mountains, and a couple of decades ago had experienced a terrible genocidal war between local religious groups. Today, veterans and citizens who were affected by the war are putting their lives back together and trying to heal wounds of the past. Civilizations have lived here since the Paleolithic era, which was from 12,000 to about 50,000 years ago, according to scientists. It is essentially the cradle of European civilization. People here have lived close to the land for eons, and are reluctant to let go of that intimacy with their environment. On May 26, 2013, 48-year-old Blazo Gurkovic was tending his flocks near the foot of Volujak Mountain. He was a shepherd who was kind of a throwback in some ways. He would spend each summer watching his sheep as they grazed on the hills and make sure they were safe and healthy. In 1992, when the Balkan War broke out, Blazo joined the army as a first-class fighter in the Gatakoj Brigade. He knew how to defend himself under pressure and was known to be a steady man under stressful and intense situations. The lessons of the war would serve him well on this day. The month of May is the beginning of the mating season for brown bears. Male bears will often sniff the daybeds and urine of receptive females. The boar will be able to tell how close she is to estrus based on chemicals and scents in her urine. As she approaches estrus, he will begin to follow her closer and closer and begin to court her. The sow will initially run away until she gets closer to estrus and tolerates his presence more. Gradually, the instinctive drive to breed will overcome each bear's tendency toward solitary life, and they will culminate their brief romance with several days of mating before splitting up once again. As Blazo walked the grassy slopes, searching for a baby goat which had disappeared recently, he was blissfully unaware of a dangerous predator observing him from the nearby brush. As he walked past a stand of bushes, a medium-sized female brown bear pounced on the man and clamped her jaws onto his leg. As you can imagine, life as a shepherd is lonely but also requires self-reliance. If you are stricken with fear while you are in the woods, it is definitely not the line of work for you. If things go bad, you may be the only resource you have, and being comfortable with that fact is requisite for the job. Instead of panicking, Blazo reached out for his trusty carpenter's axe. As the bear pulled at his leg, trying to pull him onto the ground to easily dispatch him, Blazo wound up his carpenter's axe like an all-pro baseball player. He swung the axe with everything he had toward the neck of the bear and hit pay dirt. The bear fell flat on its back, but Blazo wasn't done yet. At this point, most people would take the opportunity to run, but he jumped on top of the bear, wrapping it up in a bear hug and wrestling with it while on the ground. After holding the bear on the ground, he began to chop at it with his axe. Blazo and the bear wrestled for several minutes, and as they did, the bear bit him several times in his arms and legs. Blazo wasn't the kind of guy to let pain or blood scare him, and continued to battle the bear, as he knew it was a fight for survival. After Blazo landed several strikes with his axe, the bear managed to knock it from his hands. The strike from the bear's paws happened so quickly that he still cannot recall exactly how it sent his axe flying. At one point, Blazo's arm was in the bear mouth, and it was tossing its head back and forth in a motion that would typically break a human being's bones. While the bear bit and chewed on his left arm, he used his right hand to pinch off the bear's air supply. He squeezed the bear's windpipe with all of his might, while its teeth tore through his left arm. After receiving so many blows from Blazo's axe, the bear was strangled to death by him. After the sow quit moving, Blazo looked up and saw a huge male brown bear in the bushes nearby. It was the sow's prospective mate. Upon making eye contact with Blazo, the giant boar immediately beat a hasty retreat back into the woods and away from Blazo and his axe. Regaining his feet, Blazo realized he was injured much more severely than he initially believed. He couldn't stand, let alone walk back to camp. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and placed a phone call to his brother for assistance. His brother immediately called for an ambulance to Blazo's location, and he was rushed to the hospital. At the hospital in Floka, Blazo's injuries were documented to be a laceration on his face from the bear's claws. His left arm had at least 3 severe bites to it, which tore tissues as well as broke the bones in his forearm. Blazo also had puncture wounds from the bear's teeth and claws on the leg she initially bit onto. He was in serious condition, but his initial prognosis was good. Pictures of Blazo's wounds will not pass YouTube viewing requirements, so I posted the on my Patreon link below. I do warn you that they are graphic, so view them at your own risk. The local police were charged with investigating the incident. Upon arriving at the attack scene, they observed that Blazo's axe blows had nearly completely decapitated the sow. With her husband expected to make a full recovery, Blazo's wife Mira reports that her husband inherited his strength from his great-grandfather, Stephen, who was a famous strongman in Herzegovina. Grizzly Adams Gacko, as his friends affectionately call him, says he was lucky to land the initial blow with his axe. It stunned the bear and gave him the upper hand in the battle. He states his survival was due to his ability to stay calm and not panic. Brown bear populations in Bosnia are estimated to be somewhere between 400 and 1,200, and they are currently protected by law. Well, that is one crazy story that Blazo will be able to tell his grandkids. After reviewing the details of this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think this bear attack was caused by Blazo disrupting the brown bear's courting behavior? Do you think this bear attack was a predatory or defensive attack? Why do you think the larger boar ran away after the sow was killed? Was Blazo just lucky to avoid losing his life? Do you think Blazo will get an endorsement from a company after his amazing exploits? I will be glad to read your thoughts, so please post them below in the comments section, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to somewhere we've never been. Well, almost. It is still in Russia, but our scene is in the south, near the Georgia border, in the Caucasus Mountains. A relatively undeveloped province by the name of Kabardino-Balkaria has rolling topography between steep rocky peaks, which are pastoral and picturesque. The modern descendants of the ancient people known as the Zykia have lived among these mountains since the 6th century BC. Common trees of this area include forests of pine, birch, and oak, which give way to alder, hazel, and rhododendron at higher elevations. Common animals here include the endangered western Caucasian tur, which is a wild sheep with broad, impressive horns. There are many small predators here like weasels, foxes, and jackals. It looks like heaven on earth to a man who loves the mountains and wilderness, except one significant detail: there are lots of brown bears here. In the northern part of the province, fall had brought severe flooding. This corrupted or washed away important food resources bears needed to fatten up for winter, putting them in a dire situation, and consequently the people of the area as well. Hungry bears were reported across the province, pushing into municipal boundaries and forcing strained interactions with people, their livestock, and communities. On November 1st, 2013, 80-year-old shepherd Yusuf Alkagirov was performing his farm chores the same way innumerable prior generations did before him, by walking the hillside and tending his sheep while they browsed the grasses and bushes of the meadows. The day in question was relatively normal prior to Yusuf's sheep scattering into a field below him. Sheep are not the brightest of animals, and when one goes a certain direction, it's common that the others will follow them, so it didn't seem too far out of ordinary for Yusuf. This time, though, he could see that the sheep were not just following each other. They were fleeing, something which scared them. Yusuf is remarkably spry and energetic for an 80-year-old man. He's lived in these mountains in the same village with his wife and family for his entire life. His family have cultivated many plants on his farm, and the effort yielded dividends for them in the form of food and work. As Yusuf shuffled through a big raspberry patch to head off his wayward sheep, he saw his sheep below him. He barked his familiar commands to them, and they began to turn around and head back to their pasture. Yusuf slowly walked along with his sheep, but had a strange feeling he was being watched. He was familiar with his environment and knew when something strange was in the air. He glanced around the raspberry patch and saw a gigantic brown bear crouched in a stalking position, clearly watching the shepherd approach it. He knew he couldn't run, as it might trigger the bear to chase him and kill him. Yusuf stared for seconds, which passed like hours, waiting for the bear to give away its motives. Perhaps if he froze and didn't react to the bear's watchful gaze, it would move on and leave him and his sheep alone. The bear and the man sized each other up for a few seconds before the bear clearly made up its mind. Yusuf watched helplessly as the bear's hind feet set in the soil and its front paws lifted in a long bound as it initiated its charge toward him. There were tens of sheep just below the man, but the bear's eyes were focused exclusively on Yusuf. His terror mounted as he watched the bear's paws reach out to bring it closer with each stride, its head floating statically as the rest of its body churned with each powerful bound. The ground between him and the bear had sparse cover and a slight slope toward Yusuf. He knew the bear would be on him before he could turn around, so he braced himself to fight for his life. As the bear closed in on Yusuf, he quickly removed his jacket in an attempt to use it as a matador's capote. The bear was a mere few feet from Yusuf, with its massive jaws held wide open, waiting for any part of the man to clamp onto, when he wrapped his jacket around its head. Yusuf immediately began punching the bear in the face. He landed several strikes before the bear freed itself from his jacket. Now enraged, the bear spun toward him and drove its teeth deep into the tissues of his forearm. Yusuf could feel his arm bones cracking under the immense pressure and wrenching action of the bear's bite. He reached his free hand over and grabbed the bear's lower jaw. He twisted and pried the bear's jaws from his forearm, then quickly plunged his newly freed hand into his pocket. Yusuf carried a pocket knife everywhere he went as a tool. It was a small weapon, but better than nothing. He quickly flicked the blade of the knife open with his freed arm, while still holding onto the bear's lower jaw with the other. As Yusuf guided the blade toward the bear's head, it quickly swiped its massive paw across his hand holding the knife, knocking it from his grasp. Now face to face, the bear wrapped its massive arms around Yusuf and picked him up in a bear hug a few feet off the ground. Bears do this to make sure to hold the object of their aggression close for a deadly bite. Yusuf was a quick thinker. He realized the bear's head was now very close to his, and his arms were tangled up in the bear's grasp, so he used the only weapon he had at his disposal, his head. Yusuf pulled his head back a few inches and drove his forehead into the massive brown bear's nose as hard as he could. The bear was so surprised and apparently hurt by this blow that it immediately dropped him to the ground. The bear was now facing away from Yusuf at this point, and he was not done fighting it. He had one target within his reach, and began kicking the bear. He kicked the bear in the crotch several times as the bear turned and spun, trying to get an angle on this human attacking him. Yusuf and the bear wrestled back and forth, with the man finding a way to prevent a fatal bite or swat several times. But that wouldn't last for too much longer. The bear again wrapped Yusuf up in a bear hug and lifted him a few feet off the ground. In the action and confusion of the fight, the bear used its arms to toss Yusuf off a 25-foot-high cliff. Yusuf landed on the rocky ground at the bottom of the cliff and was knocked unconscious by the impact. The bear had apparently had enough of Yusuf and meandered off, leaving the injured and unconscious man to his fate at the bottom of the cliff. For 7 hours, Yusuf lay unconscious, sprawled on the ground. He regained his consciousness and slowly recovered his balance. As he glanced around, and his bearings came back to his mind, he began to wander in the direction of his home. As he stumbled and staggered his way toward his home, a group of villagers who had been sent out to find him approached. His wife had become worried after he missed dinner, and asked them to go find him. Yusuf had suffered 4 broken ribs from the 2 bear hugs and the wrestling match. His left arm had a large bite wound and several smaller bite wounds and bruises. His wife was so happy that he lived, she went to work in the kitchen while he recovered for a few days in the hospital. She cooked him not 1, but 3 of his favorite pies. Yusuf consumed all 3 pies in one sitting as a gluttonous celebration of life and his victory in hand-to-paw combat over the enormous brown bear. Yusuf stated that he got off easy, that if he had chickened out, the bear would have killed him. When asked about his bear fighting techniques, Yusuf said that it was a defensive technique his father had taught him. He was shown that a bear's nose is very sensitive, and if you hit them hard enough there, they might back down from attacking you. The villagers decided the bear was only playing with Yusuf and chose not to pursue and kill it. Wow, I can only hope that I'm as tough and as lively as Yusuf when I'm 80 years old. After reviewing the reported facts around this case, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think the bear was planning on killing and eating Yusuf, or was it just curious like the villagers thought? If it was hungry, why didn't the bear pursue the sheep? Do you think Yusuf actually hurt or injured the bear during the fight? I'm not sure what Yusuf's wife put in those pies, but they must be delicious for him to go through so much to get one. Your thoughts are important, so please post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. This episode occurred on the island of Kunshur in the Kuril island chain currently governed by Russia, but just north of the Japanese island of Hokkaido. Kunshur is a largely undeveloped place with volcanoes, hot springs, and picturesque scenery. Oh, and bears. Lots of bears. The evening of October 22nd, 2019, Alexei Ivanovsky and several of his friends were out for a little R&R to take a break from the Russian army base on the island. One of their favorite activities was to go along the shore and catch crabs and cook them for dinner. The group brought the necessary equipment, which included waders, buckets, and small shovels. They were in for an easy day, or so they thought. The crabbing party was pulling in quite a haul throughout the day and were excited about their dinner plans. The group was a little spread out along the vast beach, but within shouting distance of each other. Alexei was on a small hill of sand and searching out crabs by himself. To find the crabs, you have to locate small tunnels that they hide in. Then
Then you have to carefully reach in and grab the crab by the back of its body. Otherwise, it can pinch you with its claws. As Alexei focused on gathering the last couple of crabs he would need to top off his bucket, he didn't pay as much attention to his surroundings as he should have. This late in the fall, many bears are fat and getting ready to den for hibernation for the winter. If bears are around at this time of year, it's likely because they are not fat enough to hibernate and are desperate to find more food to survive the winter. As Alexei dug around in the sand, all the activity he and the others were participating in had drawn the attention of a sow bear with her cubs. They hadn't had enough food to build up their fat and were very hungry. This heightened state of awareness had them focusing on Alexei and his friends. The sow bear headed up a short swale that led her to just behind Alexei, while her cubs circled him from the other direction. By the time Alexei saw them, they had completely surrounded him, and he had nowhere to go. The sow slowly stalked up to the man, who was now facing her. She jumped a bit closer to him and clamped her powerful jaws onto his lower leg. Alexei screamed and drew the attention of his friend, who came to save him. The bear saw the people coming toward her and her cubs with their victim, and she dragged him off a short distance. The sow immediately started to bite and claw Alexei all over his body. Suddenly, she focused her attack on his head and started tearing and removing Alexei's scalp from the back of his head. She pulled and tore his entire scalp and continued to pull the hide from his back. He covered his face and lay prone, trying to protect himself, but she was ravenous and had to feed her cubs as well as herself. She pulled and bit and eventually tore all of his skin from his shoulders and continued until she had pulled all the skin from his back. He couldn't feel the pain due to the adrenaline, but was in a dire situation. Next, the sow started pulling the skin from Alexei's buttocks and claws it away from his body, leaving him without any skin on the parts of his body she could access. Still facing the ground, Alexei was terrified, and efforts to resist her seemed to energize her more. She finally began chewing on his right leg and tore off flesh and skin, trying to flip him over, her claws and jaws utterly destroying his thigh muscle. By now, Alexei's friends had arrived at the violent and bloody attack scene. They pelted the bears with rocks in a vain attempt to save Alexei. Alexander, one of Alexei's friends, tried to save his friend so fervently that he was wounded by the bear, but nothing very serious. In a last-ditch effort, Alexei's friends got into the vehicle and drove it up to the bear and shined the headlamps in an attempt to frighten the bear. After some time, the tactic worked, and she and her cubs slowly left the area. Alexei's friends began administering basic first aid while help was summoned. As his friends were trying to take care of him, Alexei died, but the first responders resuscitated him. Alexei was bandaged up the best they could, and then they rushed him to the medical helicopter. They flew him 250 miles to the hospital in Yunzo-Sakhalinsk. Alexei survived for 9 days as the doctors sutured him and amputated his destroyed leg, as well as reattached his ear that was torn off in the attack. He received antibiotics to fight off any infection he may have contracted from the attack. Alexei managed to hold on for 9 days of intensive medical attention, but eventually succumbed to his wounds and had a heart attack. Alexei's attack spawned a tremendous outcry, and many people rushed to donate blood and held prayer vigils in his honor. He left behind his wife and kids and his proud service to his country in the army. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the remote Siberian wilderness, a beautiful and wild place that we visited in our prior episodes, the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia's Far East. The area is known as the Kronotsky Wildlife Reserve, not far from where our episode discussing Igor and Olga Moskalyova occurred. The geography of the peninsula is thick with alder and other scrub brush, as well as groves of pine, fir, and birch trees. Vitaly Nikolyenko was a 66-year-old bear researcher. He was a self-taught naturalist and wildlife photographer. This is his 33rd year living with brown bears and documenting their mating rituals, social interactions, and feeding habits. The bears tolerated him and his intrusion into their environment, although he had to tumble down a few cliffs and climb some trees to avoid charging bears at times. He was a senior ranger working on the reserve and would spend several months each year at remote locations performing his research. Vitaly was renowned among the bear research sphere of scientists, filling hundreds of journals and thousands of pages with his observations, field notes, and illustrations. He traveled an estimated 1,000 kilometers per year through the wilderness of the reserve, warding off poachers and illegal fishermen. Vitaly documented over 800 bear contacts per year, and he knew many of the bears personally, if you will. His favorite was an older male he named Dobrynya, whom he would curl up near and sleep by on occasion. The year 2003 was a peculiar year, in that the bears had not gone into hibernation by late December. It was most likely due to an environmental cause, like a low salmon run or berry crop in the area. He was waiting for a helicopter out of the reserve for the season, from the warmth and safety of the park cabin he called home while on duty. While preparing some tea, Vitaly looked out the window and saw his old friend, Dobrynya, walking right past the cabin on the bear trail. He grabbed his camera and his skis and followed the slow-moving Bruin toward the lake. He also brought his bear spray and his flare gun to scare the bear in case of a problem. Dobrynya slowly waddled his way up the snow-covered trail a few hundred yards ahead of Vitaly. The man always enjoyed listening to his bear friend's deep groans and rumbles as he was getting ready to rest, so Vitaly hurried to catch up. His cross-country skis allowed him to stay on top of the snow and slide across the crust, which helped him to make up ground on the bear. It only took about a mile before Vitaly saw Dobrynya's tracks entering into a thick grove of alders. He couldn't enter while standing up, nor on his skis, so he set them aside and crawled into the bush, just like the bears had to do. As he approached the bear, he moaned and gesticulated in the manner that he knew they would accept. He continued forward and snapped some pictures for his memory book. On the 1st of January of 2004, just a few days after Vitaly's reacquaintance with Dobrynya, the helicopter arrived at the cabin, but couldn't seem to find Vitaly. His tea was on the window still, but it was cold. He couldn't have gone far, but they called in a search team anyway. The search team arrived at the cabin and began following Vitaly's ski tracks toward the lake. After a mile or so, they found his skis sticking up vertically in the snow, obviously placed there. His tracks went into the alders, so the search team followed suit. Several yards into the grove, they found Vitaly's body, lying in the snow, not more than 3 yards from Dobrynya's bear bed. They could see the bear's tracks running toward the man, as well as the discharged orange color of the bear spray around Vitaly's body, with his unfired flare gun lying next to him. Dobrynya's 6.5-inch wide tracks right next to Vitaly's body embedded deeply into the snow. His broken and bloody camera now rested upon the blood-stained snow beside him. The rescue party brought him back for burial and goodbyes from his community. Vitaly's controversial observation methods were broadly criticized in the scientific circles, and his death seemed to be confirmation for his critics. Many of the bears he had made comfortable in his presence were killed by poachers shortly before and after his death. Just 2 months before Vitaly's death, Timothy Treadwell and his girlfriend were killed in Alaska. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. This episode takes us to familiar territory. If you've watched our previous stories on Olga Moskalyova, Vitaly Nikolyenko, and Alexei Ivanovsky, then you will know we are talking about the Russian Far East. We are returning to Kamchatka, to a beautiful place called Lake Kurilskoye. As you can see by our map, we are now near the center of 5 cases regarding attacks we previously discussed. The Senkabetsu bear attack on Hokkaido, Japan, the Kinshir Island attack, the Olga Moskalyova attack, and the Vitaly Nikolyenko attack, and then the topic of today's episode. If you're picking up on a pattern here, you're not the only one. These islands are some of the most sparsely populated areas when it comes to humans, yet we've documented some of the most tragic, violent, and unfortunate bear attacks ever. After today's episode, you may agree with me that this area of the world is most likely the most dangerous in regard to deadly bear attacks. The location is beautiful Lake Kurilskoye. With its clear waters and cool temperatures, it receives very few visitors each year. Any visitors that may find their way there might be photographers, researchers, and possibly fishermen. Otherwise, you can count on solitude, peace, and bears. Lots of bears. Michio Hoshino is an extremely accomplished wildlife photographer, observer, and researcher in his mid-40s. He was born in Japan and moved to Alaska to photograph brown bears in the 70s. His photos, videos, and artwork have brought the farthest corners of the world into the canvas and lighting of galleries around the world. In 1996, he was hired to do photography on a documentary about brown bears in Kamchatka. The first few days of filming went great, but on day 3, the photography crew lucked upon a very large male brown bear that did not mind the crew approaching within a few yards of him while he fished. The bear would simply ignore the crew, and they recorded some amazing footage of the giant bruin as it gorged itself on salmon just a few meager yards away from their lenses. The next day, they returned to the same spot, and there he was again. He seemed to relish the spotlight and played and showed off for the crews. He was not aggressive or threatening in any way, even though the photographers would sometimes approach within 5 yards to film him eating. The crew continued this for a third day and decided to make the hike to the lake to watch the big bear fish as part of their regular trip to gather footage. The big bear seemed content as he pulled in huge salmon and effortlessly tore them apart right in front of the crew. Some of these fish weighed about half as much as the men watching. It was on the 4th day, during the morning hike up the trail, that the crew noticed large piles of scat close to their camp in the trail to the big bear's fishing hole. They continued their hike and noticed his tracks and scat were placed over their boot tracks in the trail from when they returned to camp the prior day. Well, this is bear country, and we are hiking on a bear trail, so a certain amount of that can be expected. The photography crew went on about their filming trek for the day, but when they got to the big bear's fishing hole, he wasn't there. They were bummed, but they couldn't just return with a bunch of film of the same bear doing the same thing anyway. That would be boring. They finished up with a few shots of a sow and cubs that they watched for the afternoon and returned back to camp just before evening. As the men made it down the hill to the main trail back to camp, they noticed more bear scat. It was the big boar's tracks, and this time his tracks were in their boot tracks from their hike up this morning. That evening, the Russian guide asked Michio if he would please consider sleeping inside the cabin with the rest of the crew, as the presence of the bear tracks around camp indicated a potential for danger. Michio loved the sensation of being outside and sleeping in his tent under the stars, so he politely declined. After all, he had had over 20 years of filming and photography with bears and other wildlife this way, and wasn't feeling threatened by the presence of the bear. The guide deferred to the preferences of the experienced photographer, and they all retired to their beds for some rest and relaxation. After dinner and conversation, Michio made his way the short distance from the cabin back to his tent. He didn't have any food in his tent and nothing else tempting for bears like sweets or flavored drinks. He didn't pack a firearm and didn't see a need for bear spray while you're sleeping. He positioned his sleeping bag just beneath the window in the tent so he could stare out at the stars and feel the fresh air on his face while he slept. He curled up in his sleeping bag, in his tent, on the shore of Lake Kuril, and allowed the lapping of the water on the shore to lull him to sleep. As Michio slept, around 4 a.m., the big bear crept up on him and sniffed his scent through the tent window. Upon smelling Michio, the bear pounced on the sleeping man, biting his shoulder and swatting him with his paws. The bear tore apart Michio's tent while wrenching the man from his sleeping bag. Michio yelled in pain and woke his sleeping teammates. The Russian guide and other campers ran outside and watched by flashlight as Michio disappeared into the woods, dragging behind the running bear. The rest of the crew could only look on as their associate and friend's life was taken before their very eyes. Authorities were notified and recovery crews were assembled and helicoptered into the site. Michio's mutilated and partially consumed body was recovered as well as his tissues from the bear's stomach. The bear was put down at the site. The attack was deemed a strictly predatory attack. In fact, the bear followed and stalked the crew members for several days, as evidence shows. The world lost not only an amazing photographer, videographer, and children's book author, but a father, son, and husband. He is survived by his wife, Naoko, and a son, Homa, both of Fairbanks, Alaska, USA.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the heart of southern India. Yes, we've visited India before, but this episode is very unusual indeed. The city of Mysore is seated toward the southern tip of the continent and is overshadowed by Chamundi Hill, which rises about 1,000 feet above its surroundings. The slopes of this hill are crowded with jungles and ravines, the perfect place for a stealthy predator to scrape out a living. Atop this hill is Chamundi Temple, which holds a significant spiritual power and cultural importance to practitioners of the Hindu faith. It is said that the goddess Durga triumphed over the demon king Mahishasura on the top of the hill which he ruled. It is in this setting that our episode takes place. In 1957, the locals south of Bangalore became acquainted with a sloth bear that was not particularly afraid of them. As you may know, sloth bears are nearly exclusively herbivorous, meaning that they eat mostly fruits, nuts, or plants, but they also eat termites and other insects. They may have been known to regularly raid wild beehives and eat the honey, but that is usually the extent of their aggression. The sloth bear that the locals had run-ins with didn't have the usual disposition of the average sloth bear. This bear had spent most of its time up on the boulder-strewn slopes, avoiding people, and doing the usual sloth bear activities of food gathering and beehive raiding.
Somehow this bear had developed the habit of descending the slopes and searching out food in the lower areas near the human population. As it foraged among the villages and farms nearby, it apparently lost its fear and respect for humans. The first reported attack happened near the city of Bangalore in the Nagvara Hills. Wherever the bear found humans, it would become extremely aggressive. In some instances, the bear would see people at far-off distances and run them down to attack them. This fact removed the notion that the bear was attacking people who happened upon it and surprised it, forcing a defensive attack. Most of the 24 survivors of the bear attacks would come away missing parts of their face. The bear would use its large canines to grip the structure of the face and skull of its victims, then use its long claws, fashioned for breaking into hard termite mounds, to rip the victims' noses from their face, or sometimes it would tear their cheeks or eyes from their place. For their size, the canine teeth of a sloth bear are larger than any other species, and would inflict as much damage on victims as its claws, if not more. Every survivor of an attack by this bear was subject to a life of pain and deformation after a confrontation. This bear also killed 12 people, on top of the previously mentioned maulings. The bear partially consumed at least 3 of its victims, and some of the people it killed had their faces completely removed from their skulls during the attack. Many of them went unreported until far too late to locate the specific bear that was responsible, until the bear killed a young man connected to a professional hunter. The swath of death and destruction was first brought to the attention of professional hunter Kenneth Anderson, who was a British citizen frequenting the productive hunting grounds of India. A Muslim friend of Anderson's by the name of Alam Books had written a postcard to Anderson requesting his help in ridding the area of the predatory and deadly bear after it had killed his son. The young man was only 22 years old and had accidentally run into the bear as he was walking along a road around 9 p.m. Unbeknownst to the young man, the road to the shrine he was walking was lined with fig trees planted by the shrine attendees, and they were shedding their fruit. They had also planted a field of peanuts near the trees, which the bear loved to forage amongst. The sloth bear displayed its growing aggression on the young man by mauling him to death, prompting the postcard from Books. Anderson considered hunting the sloth bear to be much easier than other animals he'd successfully stalked and killed, such as leopards and tigers. He had already built a renowned reputation as a prolific hunter of man-eaters of various species, and considered this hunt to be a mundane effort. Given these details, Anderson didn't prepare for an extended hunt, and only gathered his .405 Winchester hunting rifle and a flashlight, plus an extra change of clothes. The first time he set out to find the bear, he gathered input from the locals in the area. They gladly provided the areas in which the sloth bear had been seen foraging for peanuts and figs. Anderson used this information and established night patrols to try to intercept the bear while it was traveling to its frequented food sources. This bear was apparently going to take more work for Anderson, as the patrols produced nothing, no leads, and certainly no dead bear. The locals next directed him to a cave in the area they believed to be the bear's den. The party eagerly arrived at the cave and discussed how they may be able to rouse the Bruin without risking an attack themselves. They decided to hurl rocks into the cave and see if they could elicit a response from the bear. As they threw the stones, they would listen for any sign of movement or growling or any other reaction. This effort was fruitless as well, and they went back to the drawing board. His efforts stymied, Anderson headed back to Bangalore and requested that the villagers notify him immediately if the bear attacked anyone else. For several weeks all was quiet and well. The villagers reported no problems from the bear, and no humans were attacked or killed. Near the village of Sakrapatna, 2 loggers were out harvesting timber for sale. They had ventured into the woods to find good timber when the bear ambushed them while they worked. One of the loggers was killed before his friend could save him, and the other was severely mauled by the bear before it departed the scene of the attack. Guards from the regional forest office immediately sent notification to Anderson that the bear had struck again. He requested the coordinates of the bear's latest attack, which took an additional 10 days in response. The bear used this time span to attack a 3rd forest guard while he was out on patrol. After receiving the requested information as well as the update on the latest attack, Anderson immediately headed out to the Mysore area. He set up camp at a small dwelling owned by the forest department. At around 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, a local villager came running up, out of breath, to report that his own brother had been attacked by the bear near a place the locals thought he lived. His brother was tending his grazing cattle near the bear's lair, on a hill about 3 miles from the village. Anderson rounded up his hunting team and some local guides and immediately embarked on the 6-mile hike into the location. As the party approached the target area, many of the local guides declined to go any further out of fear of a confrontation with the bear. Incredibly, Anderson elected to pursue the bear by himself and left the rest of his hunting party where they stood. After forcing his way through thick brush, Anderson could hear a faint moan. As he followed the sound, it led him to the wounded man laying in a pool of his own blood, leaning up against a tree. The man was suffering from the typical severe head wounds sloth bears in general, and this bear specifically, was known to inflict on its victims. The man couldn't walk and was fading in and out of consciousness, so Anderson decided to try to carry him out to seek medical attention. As he was carrying the wounded man, Anderson sprained his ankle severely and could not continue, rendering both him and his wounded acquaintance incapacitated, at least in part. As Anderson administered first aid to the wounded man and himself, a small party of the forest guard stumbled upon them and evacuated them to the hospital at Chikmagalur. Unfortunately for the wounded man, he would succumb to his wounds by 5 a.m. before life-saving efforts could begin. Anderson lay up in the hospital for a week, healing from his wounds, but the bear attacked 2 more people walking along a trail near Ayankir Lake during that time. After his ankle was healed, Anderson headed back to Sakrapatna, where locals reported to have seen the bear foraging in fields surrounded by boram trees, several hundred yards from the village. Anderson decided to change his approach to hunting the bear. All of his efforts to catch it in its normal habits simply led to it appearing several miles away and wreaking havoc there, before disappearing again. Knowing that once a bear finds food in a location, it will frequently return regularly, even if there is not a reliable source of food there. Since he knew of a place where the bear routinely found food, he would post up there overnight and wait the bear out. It would be bound to turn up on its regular routes in search of food and may offer a chance to stop the carnage of the attacks it wrought. Anderson arrived at the location around 5 p.m. and set up an observation post overlooking the field at which the bear was known to dig up peanuts. He carefully positioned himself beneath a large boram tree and planned to spend the night waiting. After 6 long hours, with his rifle and flashlight watching the field as the moon set an eerie glow across the land, the dark shapes danced in his imagination as the shadows seemed to stalk him while he waited. In the distance, Anderson could hear the bear digging for roots and searching for food. After another hour of waiting and listening, Anderson heard a rustling in the bushes just a few yards from his position and figured the bear was approaching the boram tree he was hiding beneath. He quickly grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the rustling. Flicking on the switch, he could see the sloth bear was startled by the sudden source of light aimed at him. It stood up on its hind legs for a better view and to engage any threats it perceived. As it stood, it offered Anderson an excellent shot, and he placed a bullet right through the man-killer's heart, dropping it quickly to the earth. As word of the death of the violent sloth bear made its rounds to villages in the area, a mythos sprang up around the bear's behavior. Some postulated that the bear was a female robbed of her cubs by men hell-bent on retribution on the species responsible for her pain. Others offered that it was a male bear who had fallen in love with a woman and kidnapped her from a village. When hunters found her and returned her safely to her home, the bear went on a rampage out of lovesickness. Anderson proposed a more common-sense theory, that perhaps the bear had been injured in a way that forced a change to its eating habits. Other observers have a more spiritual take on the bear, that perhaps the goddess Durga periodically has to return to the top of the hill and slay the demon king Mahishasura all over again once in a while. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel. Clicking the bell icon lets you know when we release new episodes, and sharing to your social media platform shares the fun. As a valued member of our human network, please be careful out there, especially in bear country. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Wales Indian Reservation, and specifically the Kingikmik School, located in Wales, Alaska. This town sits on the westernmost tip of the Seward Peninsula, which juts into the Bering Sea. The population here is mostly Inupiaq natives, and is host to around 170 people. The town is surrounded by wilderness and nature preserves. To the north and the east lay the Bering Land Bridge Nature Preserve, and the vast expanses of tundra and taiga that pose there. The largest trees in this area are cottonwood trees, but they are few in number. The vast majority of trees here are mostly balsamwood poplar. Interspersed among the tall cotton grass, you'll find stands of willow and alder. Among the wild blueberry bushes, you'll find beautiful Arctic daisies, alpine forget-me-nots, and fireweed. The common animals of the area include caribou, moose, grizzly bears, and muskox. But seasonally, polar bears are known to hunt along the coast. The last few weeks had been a challenging season for the family of Summer Myomik. They'd been forced to leave their home while the electric system was repaired. They'd taken up shelter in the Myomik school, which frequently doubled as a shelter for locals in the center of community gatherings. It was the largest and newest building in town, so it makes sense that the families of the community would utilize it to its full potential. To outsiders, this small native outpost may seem like the end of the road, but the fact is, just past the school building, the Myomik Road does end suddenly. On January 17, 2023, at about 2:30 p.m., 24-year-old Summer Myomik and her 1-year-old son Clyde Angtawazruk were visiting their family in the Myomik school on the only street in Wales. There was a severe storm warning, and as the mother and her son were visiting their family, the storm had grown into a whiteout. With gale-force winds driving blinding sheets of snow, visibility was limited to just a few feet. Being familiar with the town was all Summer needed to find her way across a street and about 150 yards to the Wales Health Clinic for a checkup with her son. Summer's love interest and Clyde's father lived in a town a short distance away called St. Michael's. Summer spent her time visiting her family in Wales and then visiting Clyde's father in St. Michael's. Summer was well known and loved by both communities as a sweet and responsible young woman. As Summer and Clyde bid farewell to acquaintances at the school grounds, they planned to navigate the short distance toward the clinic, but a dangerous predator was well cloaked by the blizzard. Only a few yards from the school an apparition appeared. Oh, if it were only an apparition. A polar bear had stealthily stalked into the town along the seashore and had gone unnoticed by town residents, most of which were holed up riding out the storm. Now, in 2014, Wales had disbanded their polar bear patrol due to lack of funding. Polar bears were not a common sight in the area, and few incidents had been noted over the recent years, so the urgency had subsided for the patrols. But the presence of this bear would make the community of Wales woefully reconsider eliminating them. The polar bear began chasing people just outside of the school, but quickly focused on Summer and Clyde, knocking them to the ground just beyond the school entrance. Many occupants of the school and onlookers yelled and peered through the windows, while those outside dashed toward the building for escape. The bear was quickly on top of the woman and her child, biting and slashing in an attempt to subdue them. Horrified onlookers turned into mobilized resistance as several people armed themselves with shovels and ran outside. They screamed and pounded their shovels on the ground, some even hitting the bear, attempting to frighten the bear off and put an end to the attack. This worked, albeit momentarily, as the bear pursued them into the school building. As the last person entered the door, school administrator Don Hendrickson pulled the door closed just a few meager feet from the bear's nose. The bear then tried to force its way into the school briefly before returning to Summer and Clyde. The faculty of the school immediately drew the shades on the windows to prevent the students from further witnessing the terrible mauling. They ordered a lockdown and sequestered the students inside while notifying authorities. As the polar bear mauled Summer and Clyde, the entire school was held hostage to the graphic violence that Mother Nature considers mundane and part of the processes that govern nature. Alaska State Troopers were notified of the dangerous situation just beyond the school doors, but there isn't really a consistent police force present in Wales. The troopers rounded up a U.S. Fish and Wildlife contingent to travel with them, but the whiteout forced them to turn around and return. School officials called the chief school administrator for the Bering Strait School District, who immediately sent out requests for help, first to authorities, then to local community members. A brave citizen hurried to the attack scene and shot the polar bear as it mauled Summer and Clyde, bringing the attack to an end. Summer and Clyde were obviously dead from the attack, and their bodies were recovered the next day, when state troopers could safely land their planes again. The families of the victims were notified, and mourners began expressing their sadness and grief. Summer and Clyde's remains were taken to the Alaska State Medical Examiner's office for autopsies. The remains of the polar bear were taken by the U.S. Fish and Game biologist for examination, and that report hasn't been released yet. Myomik School was closed the next day, while school and community counselors, as well as a team from Nome's Norton Sound Health Corporation, served to ease the community's grief and sadness. In a prior episode, we discussed the polar bear mauling of Daryl Canuck, who was hunting with friends in 2018. Prior to that attack, the last polar bear fatality occurred 30 years before this, so it's easy to say the community was not expecting anything like this. In 1990, after a fatal polar bear attack on a man just north of Wales, the Wildlife Society undertook an analysis of the frequency of polar bear attacks in the area. They determined that between 1870 and 2014, there were only 73 documented fatalities. This list included attacks from Norway, Russia, Canada, Greenland, and the U.S. That's an average of only one fatal polar bear attack every 2 years. The study also pointed out that most of these attacks were due to nutritional stress, otherwise known as starvation. They also claimed climate change could have been a contributing factor, but didn't clearly state their reasoning. In the analysis, the numbers also bore out the relationship between younger and older male polar bears being the most significant contributors to the fatal attack frequencies. This makes sense in that younger males of any species tend to demonstrate the most risk-taking behaviors, and older males will be emboldened by hunger to pursue prey they would not normally pursue. Add in the factors that humans are the only other apex predator competing with polar bears for seals, walrus, and whales, and most likely to leave their scent on the remains of the animals they harvest, and you can see why polar bears might begin associating food with people indirectly. Given that polar bears can live to around 20 years old, it's fairly logical that they would discover gut piles or discarded carcass parts left there by humans after their harvest. After analyzing the still emerging facts surrounding this case, I'm left with a few questions. What, if anything, do you think Summer and her son could have done to prevent this tragic attack? Why didn't the community have a more organized police department? What role should the reservation or governmental authorities take to ensure a situation like this doesn't happen again? I look forward to reading your comments, so make sure to post a few below so we can talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us back to familiar territory. If you remember our episode on the Senkabetsu bear attack, you may remember the Japanese island of Hokkaido. That episode was centered on a remote village that involved one of the worst bear attacks in world history. Today's episode is located in the prefecture's largest city, Sapporo. This city has over 2 million residents and features an airport as well as a military base for Japanese National Defense Forces. The city is a typical urban landscape in composition, but more interestingly, just outside the city are very dense forests of Izo spruce, Sakhalin fir, and Sakhalin spruce, scattered stands of Erman's birch on the mountains that fade into deciduous forests of Mongolian oak, lime trees, and ash trees flow through the lowlands to the seashore. The ground is covered with dwarf bamboo in the lowlands as well. The climate here is a humid continental climate, which means there are 4 distinct seasons, but plenty of rainfall, making it similar to the Pacific Northwest of the United States. The animal life includes the Izo and Sika deer, and very unique species of squirrel, fox, and rabbit. The major predators here are the Asiatic black bear on the mainland and the Usuri or Izo brown bear on the island of Hokkaido. It is in this lush and beautiful setting that today's episode takes place. In recent years, farmers have moved from the rural areas into urban areas seeking job opportunities. This flight has led to the abandoning of a cushion of civilized and humanized zones from the edges of rapidly growing cities on Hokkaido. The farmers and subsistence practitioners used to serve as a cushion between the bears and the city, but their untidy practices of discarding food waste made bears all too comfortable around people. The abandoned areas returning to their natural state has invited brown bear territory right to the doorstep of city dwellers, now clueless on how to deal with brown bears, or any bears. Add in the lack of younger generations being familiar with firearms and hunting practices, the key ingredients for an intense and dangerous environment has developed on the island. On Friday, June 18, 2018, one of the most interesting bear attacks happened. At 3:30 a.m., a Usuri brown bear was observed near the edge of the city. He wasn't a giant bear by any means, but probably weighed around 450 to 500 pounds. As we know by prior episodes, bears on Hokkaido can stand over 8 feet tall and weigh close to 1,000 pounds when in prime shape. They frequently are very hostile and aggressive toward people. This bear was young and therefore smaller, but still big enough to injure or kill a human, any human. The bear was first reported by a resident to be running down a street in his housing development. The hapless onlooker filmed the odd side of the bear with his cell phone as he followed the bear in his vehicle. Soon other neighbors observed the bear as well, and reports of the bear began rolling in. It isn't very common to see them this close to town, so concerned locals notified authorities just to get it on their radar. Police issued a public warning about the sighting, but given the hour, not many residents took notice in time to head off the catastrophe. At about 6 a.m., a 70-year-old man was taking the household trash out. He was just a few yards from his front door and was bent over placing the trash into a bin to dispose of it. The elderly gentleman was not aware that the bear had been spotted in the area and was distracted by the chore he was doing. The bear crept up from behind the man and surprised him. It swiped at his back with its claws and gashed his skin. He was completely taken off guard and faltered toward the ground as the bear bounded down the block away. He then made his way inside and reached out to medical professionals for assistance, continuing the chain of alarms through the city officials and safety officers. As reports rolled into authorities about the bear, the animal trod a mysterious path through the city. As it ran by a resident in her 80s, the bear apparently reached out and randomly slashed her with its claws on her arm and terrified her for a few seconds before loping further down the residential road. Fortunately, her physical wounds were superficial, but the damage the terror inflicted by the attack is likely to go on for the rest of her life. Somewhere between the prior attack and the next, the bear ran upon a man in his 40s who was walking down the street. The bear bit into the man's arms and legs in numerous places. It used its claws and teeth to tear at the man's chest and back as he fought for his life. By the time the bear was finished with this attack, the man suffered numerous claw and bite wounds across nearly his entire body and suffered severe injuries, including a fractured sternum. As the wounded man lay incapacitated on the ground, the bear departed the scene and ran further into the city. If you notice, these attacks seem to ramp up in confusion, intensity, and seriousness. The longer the bear loped through the city, the more frustrated it became, but still continued toward the heart of the city. By 7:50 a.m., the bear was followed by a news reporter in a vehicle. As the reporter filmed the bear dashing through the town, it seemed to panic at being followed and approached a large metal gate blocking a road into a military barracks for the ground forces of Japan. As soldiers tried to bar the gate and ran about in panic, the bear gripped the door and pried it open, winning the tug-of-war it had with a brave soldier trying to keep it from entering. As the door flung wide, the bear charged the man and pushed him a few feet, then it slashed him across the chest. The soldier collapsed to the ground as the bear ran off, seeming to seek an escape from the unavoidable bombardment of its senses from the bustle of the city. Continuing on its chaotic dash through Sapporo, the bear next scaled a fence and entered the runway of an adjacent airport around 8:15 a.m. Given the amount of confusion the bear had already created in the city, the airport officials were quick to shut down the runways, which caused delays in flights. This seemed to be the only place the bear could find a measure of solace and escape from the honking horns and roaring engines of the streets. It spent the better part of an hour at the airport before it dashed toward the fence surrounding the runways. It apparently saw the trees nearby and hoped to find seclusion there. It scaled the fence, dashed across several more lanes of traffic, and disappeared into the forest, with local authorities soon arriving to give chase. A local hunting club was notified of the bear's escapades after the barracks attack and attacks on citizens. They grabbed their high-powered hunting rifles and responded to the threat to their city's peace and safety. They soon found where the bear had hidden itself and surrounded it in a stand of trees. 5 shots rang out as they extinguished the bear's life and ended the chaos it wrought on the citizens of Sapporo. The standing tally was 4 people injured and 1 bear dead. As in each episode, we have to examine the cause behind such tragic events. Many people consider the behavior and frenzy of the bear to be linked to the possibility that it smelled a sow and estrus in the forest across the city, or mistook a scent from the city as such. Given that the city of Sapporo is about 9 miles across at its shortest distance, I find this unlikely. Although bears are known to have the keenest sense of smell, the scent of a sow and estrus would have to dominate the smells from the city between them. This possibility is implausible, at best. That leaves open the possibility that the sow may have been located within the city. Given the dangers to a bear and the harassment it would experience with the noise of the city, it doesn't seem realistic either. So I'm asking you, why did the bear run toward traffic and noise? Why did it continue toward the heart of the city when the easiest way to avoid it would have been to turn around and run back into the forest from which it came? Did too much competition for prime breeding or feeding ground force it into the city? Did the farmlands that buffered the city in prior decades receding bring bear populations too close to it? Are the bear populations overrunning their resources after hunting faded from cultural significance? Post your comments below and let's talk about it. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks, and if you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you click the like button below and subscribed if you are not yet a subscriber. Clicking the bell icon will keep you posted of our latest releases, and sharing to your social media platforms spreads awareness and is fun. As a valued member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.